I like to start off with some background about what Inspire is and how it works and how the data is used. Because in the 2 years now that Inspire has been in place, we found that the better users understand that background, the fewer problems folks run into. To start off, Inspire stands for Integrated System for Program Implementation and Real-Time Evaluation. And essentially, Inspire is a web-based data collection and reporting system. It was developed by Penn State. It's a collaborative effort between the Penn State Epicenter and the Penn State Department of Engineering. And it was developed as a service to the Commonwealth. So there is a resource center for evidence-based prevention and intervention programs, which is made up of a broad number of state-level agencies. And Inspire was developed to assist them. At the same time, Inspire was really developed to help programs easily collect and store and analyze and communicate their data. So before Inspire was in place, we really had different providers would share their data, share their outcomes, but would report those outcomes in different ways. And they would define different outcomes in different ways. So, for instance, asking providers how many of your cases were discharged successfully. 5 different providers might use 5 different definitions of what successful discharge means, which makes it really difficult to look at data at a state level. So Inspire increases the consistency in the data collection, how the data is defined, how it's analyzed and rolled up across the sites, and also across evidence-based programs. So we have Inspire for FFT, but we also have it for multi-systemic therapy and multidimensional treatment foster care. And this consistency across the state helps provide state policymakers and funding sources with accurate and reliable data about the use of evidence-based programs and the impact that they're having statewide. So essentially, all state-funded FFT programs are expected to use Inspire. And state-funded ranges from whether you have medical assistance funding to funding through your county, which essentially comes from the state through the county. So the data in Inspire is used by the Epicenter to generate quarterly and annual reports to the Pennsylvania Resource Center for Evidence-Based Prevention and Intervention Programs and Practices. That is a mouthful. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, the Resource Center's membership includes many state offices and agencies. So every 3 months, statewide data is rolled up and shared with them for FFT and other evidence-based programs. In addition, managed care organizations and county stakeholders may request Inspire reports from providers, and we see that happening more and more as the managed care organizations and the counties become aware that Inspire exists, and they see the benefits of having an outcome report, a utilization report they can look at that presents data in a consistent and reliable way. Agencies also can use the data to demonstrate outcomes to funders and stakeholders. So the data that comes from Inspire can be a resource for really advocating for your program. And as I mentioned, the data in Inspire looks at everything from utilization, and the Inspire report even looks at some of the demographics of the population you're serving, the presenting problems, who's referring them, the outcomes, so how these youth are doing at discharge and potentially at 6 months follow-up, and implementation quality, so fidelity and dissemination adherence. All of these things are looked at through Inspire. So this is really kind of a long way of saying that having accurate data in Inspire is really important. And that comes down to you, the user, making sure that the data that you're entering into the system is accurate, which is part of where today's training is really important. Let's talk for a moment about how Inspire works. Data in Inspire comes from 2 sources. First, you all are probably familiar with the CSS, which is the data management system that FFT uses nationally and across the world. And data from the CSS actually gets integrated into Inspire each month. And one of the reasons that we've set things up this way is that it avoids users, therapists, and clinicians needing to enter data in two different places. Enter the same information in two different places. At midnight on the 6th of each month, the data from the CSS is pulled and a file is created. And then within the next few days, that data gets added into Inspire. Inspire users receive an email when that integration is complete. So once a month, you'll get an email saying integration has occurred. There is also data that is entered directly into Inspire, and that's what we'll talk a lot about today. There are certain pieces of information that are not currently collected in the CSS, but that in Pennsylvania we need in order to calculate outcomes and pieces of information that are of significant interest to our state and local stakeholders. And so there are some enrollment and discharge questions that are entered directly into Inspire. So when the time comes for one of the administrators or supervisors at your agency to run a report in Inspire, Inspire has these two pieces or two sets of data. There is data that has come from the CSS and then pulled into Inspire, and then there's also data that's been entered directly into Inspire. And all of that data can be used to generate reports on your program's outcome. So Inspire has to be able to match up that data. It has to be able to tell which kid from the CSS is matched with which youth in Inspire. And Inspire does that by using the youth's case ID. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through the enrollment screen. But essentially, every youth has a unique case ID generated by the CSS. It is not the ID that your agency assigns to the youth. It's the case ID can be found in the top left corner of the CSS summary screen. We use that same ID in Inspire, and then Inspire can tell that this data from the CSS, this data from Inspire is for the same youth. So these two pieces of information, just keep in the back of your mind as we go through the training, that the case ID is really important to matching up the data from the two systems, and that data from the CSS is integrated with Inspire each month, and that data gets pulled at midnight on the 6th of each month. There are in Inspire two types of user accounts. So there are clinical and therapist accounts. If you log into Inspire with a clinical account, should be a clinical username and password, you'll see the client data entry screens in the menu when you log in. If you log in with an administrator account, you will see in the menu options to run reports and to manage user accounts. So to add or delete users to your site's Inspire. The login screen is exactly the same, but each username and password is associated with either a clinical or an administrator account, and will bring you to either clinical or administrator screens. Some users need both types of accounts, and in that case you would actually have two usernames and passwords. And depending on which one you use, you'll either see the client data entry screens or the report screens. Inspire automatically generates those usernames and passwords. But once you are in Inspire, as you'll see, there is an option to change your username and password to something that is maybe more intuitive and personal and easy for you to remember. So, as far as resources for Inspire, we have a number of resources that have been developed over the past 2 years to help users. This link here is the link to the Inspire resource page. I'm actually going to go over there now to show you what is on there. From the Epicenter website, if you find the FFT page, which you can usually find in this right-hand menu, you'll usually see a link for FFT there. Down under Provider Resources, there's a link for FFT Inspire Resources. And there you'll see a page full of Inspire resources for FFT. There are resources for understanding your report, which would be important for the folks who are running and reviewing your reports, troubleshooting guides, the protocol for submitting your report, frequently asked questions. Here are screen guides, and much of the information that we'll be talking about today is in the screen guide. And so if you have a question down the road, a great first step is to pull up that screen guide and see if the answer to your question is in there. And then there are also data collection worksheets, which we designed to help sites track and enter their data into Inspire. So, for instance, if you pull up the enrollment worksheet here, it's going to ask the exact questions that you then find on the Inspire enrollment screen. And so we're happy to work with sites on developing a system for using those worksheets to collect information. Some sites find these really helpful because the therapists can quickly fill out the worksheet and then hand that off to an administrative assistant or clerical staff to actually enter the data into the system. I do want to quickly call your attention to a couple of resources that are on this page. One is this PowerPoint on how the CSS data impacts your Inspire outcomes. It's a short 8-slide PowerPoint. We'll be covering some of this information today, but I just wanted to let you know that that is there, and it highlights that connection between the accuracy of your CSS data with what shows up in the Inspire report. And the other is the screen guide, which I mentioned just a moment ago. These are both available from the Inspire resource page. This is the clinical user screen guide, and you'll see on the second page is the table of contents, and it covers everything from account basics, how to change your username and password, navigating the system, where to go for help, on down to an overview of the enrollment screens, discharge, and discharge follow-up screens. And in the user guide, it explains a lot of information about how to answer the questions that you'll see on that screen. And you can see that those resources are right here: understanding the report, screen guide for clinical users. Let's get started and actually log into Inspire. This is the Inspire login page. I'm actually using the testing or demonstration site, but it looks very much like what you'll see when you log into the live site. When your Inspire username and password are established, you'll receive an email, and it should have the URL for the login page in that email. You can also find the URL for the login page on our website and in the screen guides. So the first thing you'll notice, of course, asks for your username and password. If you are having trouble logging in, there's a place to click right here, and there's a form you can fill out and indicate you're having difficulty logging in, and we will respond to you as quickly as we can. I would say that 95% of the time when folks are having difficulty logging in, it's because they've forgotten their username or password, but we can easily resend that information to you from the Inspire system. So I will type in a username and password here, and we're going to start off by looking at the therapist screens or the clinical screens. Doesn't want to respond to me at the moment. There we go. All right. So this is the home page for Inspire. It will look the same whether you have logged in as a clinical user or an administrator. You would see your name here. There is a link here to report a problem if something comes up while you're in Inspire. Return to the home page or log out. The part that will be different depending on how you've logged in is the menu here. And if you click on this drop-down menu, you'll see that because we've logged in as a clinical user, it has options for client data entry, as well as account management, which is where you would go to change your username or password. If you are logged in as an administrator, this drop-down menu would have options for creating and deleting accounts, as well as for running reports. One thing that I'd like to note before we get into the screens is in terms of the general navigation of the system, you want to be sure that as you're working in Inspire, you only click on links within the Inspire screen. If you use this back button in your browser or the refresh button, it will kick you out of the system. So if you need to go forward or back within the Inspire pages, you want to use the links that are provided within Inspire to do that, and not use those back or refresh buttons. Again, we have this report problem link, and we really encourage providers to use that. If you run into an issue while you are in the system, it's often very difficult if you wait, a few days and happen to mention down the road that you ran into something funky with the system. Folks often have a hard time remembering, well, what exactly was I doing and what happened? But the more detail we have on our end in the Inspire team, the better able we are to resolve and look into what the issue is. So if something strange comes up while you're in the system or you run into a problem or a question, please use this report problem link. You can also, of course, contact us at the Epicenter, and in the screen guide there's a part you'll see where it asks how to request help or assistance, and in the screen guide is an email, a phone number you can use if you need help. And also when we get to the end of the training this morning, we will again share where to go if you're having trouble and need to get help. But this report problem link is always a great place to start. So let's get started with the enrollment screen. On the FFT menu, you would just click enrollment, and of course this is where you'll start when you have any case that's opened. There is a drop-down menu here where you will see youth's names and case IDs. These are all fictional cases here. This menu can be sorted by name or by ID. You see here it switched to sort by ID. And if you start to just type in the youth's name or ID, it should pull them up from that menu, so that if you have a long list of clients, you don't need to always scroll through the long list. So we talked a little bit earlier about integration and how data from the CSS gets integrated into Inspire. If you wait until after you have entered a new case into the CSS, and then wait until integration has occurred before you enter their enrollment data in Inspire, you will see that youth's name in the drop-down menu here under existing clients. So some agencies like to wait until after integration has occurred and then go start entering all of the youth's Inspire data and wait to put the enrollment data in until after integration. That is actually the only data from the CSS that you will see directly in Inspire. All of the other data that's been integrated is stored behind the scenes, and you won't see it on the screens. If you want to if you have a youth and you've entered them in the CSS as a new case and you want to hop right on over to Inspire and go ahead and get them enrolled there, you would need to click New Case and enter their case ID and their first and last name here. If you do that, it's extremely important that you use the correct case ID and that it matches the case ID from the CSS. And again, remember that is an ID that's generated by the CSS. It's a unique ID for each youth, and you would find it in the top left corner of the summary screen in the CSS. And in fact, if a youth has been in FFT more than once, if for some reason this is their second course of FFT, they will have a new case ID for the second episode of treatment. So you would need to make sure that you are using the case ID for the correct episode of treatment. So in this case, we're going to just, as an example, pull an existing case from our drop-down menu here, and we will use Jill Jones. And you'll see when I selected her from the menu, it indicates here, Inspire enrollment data is submitted, which means, as you can see, I've already answered some questions about Jill Jones and hit the submit button down at the bottom in the past. So there's already some data in there, and that's what this blue note is telling me. It also says CSS enrollment data has not been integrated yet. So what that tells me is there has not been any integration of CSS data with Inspire since I entered Jill's information on the enrollment screen. And that data will be integrated in the next month when integration occurs after the 6th of the month. When you're done entering data on a screen, you always want to be sure to hit submit. And as we'll see shortly, once you hit submit, you'll see a screen pop up that says thank you for entering your data. If you fail to hit that submit button, if you put in all the youth data and then you just go ahead and log out or pick another youth, that data won't be saved. So always hit the submit button. All right, so now we've got a youth. We need to answer some questions on the enrollment screen. The first question has to do with the youth's risk of placement. And you'll see 3 options, and this is a really important question. You want to make sure that you're answering it as accurately as possible. This choice, the youth is stepping down from out-of-home placement, is probably the most obvious one. You indicate that if you have a youth stepping down from placement, coming out of detention or residential care or whatever the case might be. Folks often have a harder time between the other 2 questions. The youth is not at immediate risk, or the program is being used as a diversion from placement and the youth is at immediate risk of placement. This second one, the program is being used as a diversion from placement, youth is at immediate risk. We want you to choose that if you have a youth who's being enrolled in FFT in lieu of out-of-home placement. So this is really their last chance at being treated in the community. This is a youth where if they don't make progress in FFT, or let's say they're involved with the delinquency system, they get in trouble again. This is a kid who's going to be, very likely placed. If you have a youth who is not as heavily system involved, or their behaviors haven't been as severe, and they're not, they're certainly at high risk for delinquency, they're moving in that direction, but they're not a kid who's likely to be placed in the next few months. You're thinking, well, down the road, if they keep on this path, yeah, they're at risk for placement. You would answer not at immediate risk, because we're really looking at the here and now. Is this kid right now at high risk of being placed if they're not doing well, or if they are getting in trouble out in the community? We want you to answer this question based on the information available to you when the youth comes into the program. Preferably the source of this information would be the person or the agency that's referred the youth to you, but the FFT supervisor or intake staff can make that final determination about whether you think the youth is at imminent risk of placement using this definition. Knowing the youth's background and your community and your county's court system and how all of that works. How likely is this kid to be placed? And out-of-home placement can really refer to any type of placement in the dependency system, foster care, juvenile justice system, drug and alcohol treatment, mental health system. Any of those would constitute, can constitute an out-of-home placement. If you don't know the answer to that, you can leave that question blank. And the same is true for any questions. We want to ensure the information in Inspire is accurate, so we don't want you to be making, just kind of a guess as to what the answer is to a question. It should always be informed by information. The next question here is to check all of the presenting problems identified at intake. So the sources of information for this can be the referral source, members of the youth's interagency service planning team, their ISPT, the youth, the caregiver. Again, just like with the risk of placement, we want this to be based on information available to you when the youth is starting treatment. So we know that information about presenting problems sometimes changes over the course of treatment as an assessment, is done as you get to know the youth and family better. We don't want users to go back 6 weeks later and change what they put for presenting problems. We want it to be based on when this youth came in and first started the program, when you were doing that initial treatment plan and looking at information from the ISPT and from the youth and family and their psych eval, from the referral source. What were the problems identified that you were going to work on that had brought this youth in for FFT? County of residence is the next item, and this is an extremely important question to make sure that you answer. Where does the youth reside? We are working in the very near future, we're working on the ability to run reports by county and by referral source. So going down the road, your agency will probably want to do that if you serve multiple counties. But if you haven't indicated in Inspire which county a youth resides in, you won't be able to run county-level reports. So it's really important that that's in there. And that's a pretty easy, straightforward question to answer. And the last enrollment question, how many parents or caregivers participated in the first treatment session? And you can just select the number from this little menu here. We just ask that you only count caregivers. So if there's other adults in the home that maybe participated in the first treatment session, but they really are not serving in a caregiver role with the youth, then you would not count them. So, for instance, if let's say the youth lives with the grandmother and uncle's also in the home, but he really is not involved at all in the care and parenting of this youth, you wouldn't count uncle. You would just count grandma. And when you are all done with these questions on the enrollment screen, you hit submit and you will see the screen that indicates the data saved. You always want to make sure you see that screen after you've finished entering data on a client data entry screen. So the next thing we'll look at is the discharge screen. So here again, you just click discharge from the drop-down menu. We'll see the discharge screen. At this point, you wouldn't be discharging a youth if they hadn't already been enrolled. So there's no place to manually enter a youth's name and ID. You would always be selecting the youth from the drop-down menu. We'll keep going with Jill Jones here. And you'll see, in this case, it says discharge data hasn't been submitted and CSS discharge data hasn't been integrated. So there's really no discharge data in the system yet for this youth. The first two questions on the discharge screen have to do with whether the youth was satisfied with his or her experience in the FFT program and whether the youth's parents or caregivers were satisfied with their experience. We do not want users to answer this based on therapists' impression of whether the youth and caregiver were satisfied. So what we do not want is for folks to say, oh yeah, I think they had a great relationship with me as a therapist, and things were well. Yeah, I'm sure they were really satisfied with the service, and click yes. These two questions should be answered based on some type of formal, consistent method. So, if your program uses satisfaction surveys, client satisfaction surveys, or you do some sort of an exit interview with families before a case is closed, or have some other tool that you use at the time of discharge, that could be the source of information for indicating whether or not they are satisfied. If you have a survey that you use for your client, it would just be important to set some kind of consistent threshold for determining when their ratings or what have you on that tool are counted as satisfied or not satisfied. So if it's, let's say, a satisfaction survey with a Likert rating scale, and they're answering some questions, rated from 1 to 5, then you would want to figure out, well, what does the average rating need to be before we count this youth or this parent as satisfied, and use that average cutoff consistently. And if you don't have this information, you just leave these questions blank. The next question is, did the youth achieve the goals on his or her treatment plan, yes or no? You would answer yes if the youth and family met most or all of the goals on their treatment plan. Most or all of their goals. If your program has worked with stakeholders in your community to establish some specific criteria for considering a youth's treatment goals as met, you would use that to complete this item. So if, for instance, you've worked with your county and determined that you want to make sure that youth achieve at least 80% of the goals in their treatment plan, and that is the cutoff or criteria in your community for determining that goals are met, then that's what you could use to answer this question. But if you don't have that with your stakeholders, then again, it would just be were most or all of the goals met. The next two questions here have to do with school attendance and school performance. These are items that are of particular interest to the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, because certainly continued engagement in school is a predictor of better outcomes for youth, and also the Department of Education. So these two questions here, the first is, did the youth show improvement in school attendance during his or her time in the FFT program? And the second, did the youth show improvement in academic? And you have three choices for each of these. Worse, so their attendance or their academics got worse, no change, or improved. And these questions would be answered based on the therapist and supervisor's judgment on whether the youth has demonstrated improvement in these areas. The next item asks about the youth's substance use. You'll actually see the next two questions have to do with substance use, but they get at it in a different way. So the first question is really asking for you to answer this question about youth substance use using all of the information you have available to you. So the therapist's clinical judgment, reports from the client and family and other key participants in treatment, behavioral or emotional signs of use, and if there's any drug screens, the results of those. So you're really using that broad wealth of information available to you. And based on the last 2 months of treatment, the youth's substance use, was it eliminated, reduced, so the frequency or intensity lessened, continued with no change, increased, so they're using more frequently or more intensely, or this option, the youth has no history of substance use. So you would pick one of these answers. And we do ask for any questions regarding substance use that you do not count tobacco use. And that's because many youth, especially as we start to get into discharge and then later follow-up data, tobacco use, while posing obviously a significant health concern, may not be illegal as we get into youth turning 18 and being of age to purchase tobacco. The next question specifically gets at substance use by asking about drug screens. So has the youth had a drug screen for which you know the result, positive or negative? If they have had a drug screen and you know the result, you would click yes. And then once you click yes, this section pops up where you can indicate the information. And again, you would only enter screenings if you know the result. You would enter the date here. Just pick. If you click on the little calendar here, a little pop-up calendar will appear. We'll say that they've had a drug screen on Monday. The result was negative. Was it ordered, yes or no? A yes. And completed by, you would look up here, there's a little menu of choices who completed the drug screen. We'll say in this case it was JPO. So we would pick the code, the number that goes with that source. We definitely need these numbers to be used so that we can code the information. So please do not type in the probation officer or the person's name. If you want to add screenings, there's a button here to add screens. And you can also delete a screen. When you hit delete, it's going to delete whichever row from that table you've selected. So make sure that you have clicked on the row that you want to delete. Here I'm going to click this one, it turns gray and it disappears. Because if I've selected the row where I just entered data and I hit delete, that will disappear. So just be conscious of that when you are using this delete screening button. If you do not have an exact date for the drug screen, but you know the general time frame when it was given, you can still enter it. So for instance, if you know, okay, well I know that the family took this youth to their family doctor last week, and the family doctor did a drug screen, but I don't know exactly what date it is. You could just pick Wednesday of that week. However, if you know, gosh, I know they did a drug screen sometime last month, but you really have no idea when in that month span that drug screen was done, you would need to ideally follow up and get the date. But if that's not possible, you would leave that information out. Again, if folks have any questions, feel free to enter the questions in the chat pod in Adobe Connect, and I'll look at that periodically and make sure that I answer questions. All right, so for this case, I'm just going to give some quick answers up here just so we can move on. Just kind of click through those questions for you, and I'll hit submit. So you'll see with the enrollment and the discharge screens, there are really only a few questions on each of those screens. The last place that we will enter data for the youth is the discharge follow-up. Now this follow-up screen helps us to report out 6-month follow-up data in the Inspire reports. We know that not all sites collect follow-up data at this time, but it's something we really encourage folks to do. This information is really valuable to communicating the impact of your program beyond discharge. In Inspire, in the report will count follow-ups that were 6 months out from the youth's discharge. So the date is going to need to be specifically 149 to 211 days after their discharge date. That corresponds to a window of 5 to 7 months. A great way to track and make sure that the discharge follow-up dates are in that range of 149 to 211 days is to go online. There's some great resources you can use. For example, there's a website, timeanddate.com, where you can put the discharge date and then put in 149 days, and it will tell you when does your window for that follow-up start, what date is 149 days from discharge, and what date is 211 days from discharge. Because if you just go with 5 months and assume, okay, youth was discharged December 1st, so April 1st is 5 months out, it may actually be just outside of the window using the parameters that Inspire calculates with, 149 to 211 days. And often when folks say, we did follow-ups and they're not showing up in our Inspire report, the number one reason is that the date is outside the window. So let's see here. We'll pick a youth from the drop-down menu. We'll stick with Jill here. You'll notice here there's a bunch of discharge dates, and they all say 1/1/1900. That is the default date that Inspire uses as a placeholder if the discharge date has not yet been pulled from the CSS. So when data from the CSS gets integrated, if there is discharge data in there for the youth, their discharge date will get added in, and you'll see their actual discharge date here. These are all fictional cases that don't have CSS data. So you'll see right now that placeholder of 1/1/1900. If a case hasn't actually been discharged yet, if there's no discharge data in the system in Inspire or CSS, you won't see the youth yet in that follow-up drop-down menu. All right, so I'm going to make a new date for Jill for a follow-up interview. If there were previous follow-ups and you wanted to access one of those to look at the data or change it, you would click existing dates, and it would show up in this little menu. You'd have a choice of dates that you could pull from, and then that would bring you through to the follow-up record that you already completed. To enter a new date, we will just we'll say it was done on Wednesday. Click Next. It asks what the source of the follow-up data was from, or first, how the data was obtained. So we're going to say in this case that, let's say Jill, the therapist, or let's say clerical staff called and collected some follow-up information from Jill's parents by phone, and also a report was obtained, a copy of a report from the county's juvenile case management system. So there's also a report there. And once you've indicated that there's some information, that data was collected by one of these first 3 sources, you'll see all the rest of the follow-up questions appear. If we had clicked unable to contact or refused to interview, we wouldn't see all of those. If you are collecting information from multiple sources, so in this sample I'm walking through, I had said we got information from Jill's parent and also from the county probation office. You can choose to just enter it all in one follow-up record, just enter it all together. Or if you prefer, you can enter it as 2 different records. So you would complete the follow-up screen twice, once for the interview with Jill's mom, once for the information from the county system. If you do that, you'll need to have a different date on each follow-up. You can't have 2 follow-up records with the same date for the same youth. You need to make sure that they have 2 different dates. And it is okay to just answer the information you had available. So if you wanted to enter a record and all you had from the county probation office was information about new offenses and placements, you could just answer those 2 questions and submit. It's better to put in what you have than to not, answer any of the questions. If you want to enter 2 different sources of information all in one record, but you have conflicting information. So let's say, for instance, Jill's mom says, nope, no new offenses, she hasn't been in trouble with the law at all. But you get a report from the county that indicates otherwise. You want to err on the side of reporting a problem where one might exist. So you would err on the side of saying that, yes, there are new offenses, if one of your sources says that. However, you also want to consider what is the more accurate or reliable source of information. So if the JPO says, yeah, I think maybe this youth was placed again, but I don't really have any information about that. And then you talk to mom and she says, no, she has not been placed. She has been home. There were no placements. You would use that information based on which source you think is more reliable for the information at that. All right, so we're going to indicate the source, who is providing this information. If you are specifying an adult non-caregiver or county staff, indicate the person's relationship or role, not their name, because the name won't really mean anything to the Inspire system. All right, here we'll say we had a report from the county, a written report from the county database. So there's really only a few questions here for follow-up. The first is, has the youth been charged with a misdemeanor or felony, or adjudicated delinquent or criminally convicted for a new offense since discharge? So the question really gives you the exact definition we want you to use when indicating if the youth has had any new offenses. This question focuses specifically on criminal behavior, so you wouldn't indicate if it was a status offense or non-criminal violation of probation. It focuses specifically on incidents that happened since discharge. So we'll say here that yes, there has been a new offense. Next, you're asked if the youth has any placements since discharge from FFT. And if you select yes, then you'll have a choice of indicating what type of placement it was. So really, what system placed the youth? And you can indicate more than one. So for instance, let's say the youth was placed through the juvenile justice system because of some recurring criminal offenses, but the placement is a mental health placement because there's significant substance abuse, and she went to a DNA treatment facility and medical assistance is paying for that, and you would indicate also that it's a mental health related placement. The next question, get at behavior and substance use. How is the youth currently behaving compared to when he or she was discharged from the program? To the best of your knowledge, since discharge from FFT, has the youth used drugs or alcohol? Again, don't count tobacco use. And if you select yes for substance use, then you'll be asked to answer this next question about the frequency during the past month. So if the parent, we're 6 months out and they say, yep, you know what, she was smoking pot a little bit for that, a little bit a couple of months ago, but we addressed it, we used the skills, the things you taught us, and she's not using anymore. We nipped that in the bud. And in the past month, nope, she hasn't been using any substances. You might answer yes because they have used since discharge, but you could select no use in the past month. Those are just some examples there. Last but not least, education and employment. So, and if it's summertime or the youth has graduated, you would answer based on the previous year. So, I'm sorry, if they've graduated, you would indicate graduated high school diploma or GED. But if it's summertime, you would indicate what was the status with school at the end of the last school year. So were they not attending, they had quit school, were they in a work training program, or were they still in school? And then there's a question about employment status. The first two, full-time and part-time, should be answered based on paid employment and based on the average hours the youth works. Part-time would be less than 30 hours a week. Full-time would be 30 hours or more. Again, all these specific definitions that I'm sharing with you are in the user screen guide. So you can always look there the first time you're going through and entering data, or the first several times, and reference that to make sure that you're using those definitions and becoming familiar with what, for instance, full-time versus part-time would mean. Then there's volunteer work, which would be non-paid work, or the youth doesn't work. With the follow-up, we do, again, on that resource page that I showed earlier, I'll click over to it real quick, there is a 6-month follow-up worksheet. So you could always use that as a reference for doing follow-up interviews with the families or follow-up surveys with them. And that those questions on that worksheet would map directly onto the questions on Inspire here. Okay, so we're done. We'll hit submit. Right, and our data is successfully saved. So those are the 3 data entry screens: enrollment, discharge, follow-up. I want to go back for a moment to the PowerPoint. And before we talk about how to run the reports, I just want to touch base about a few of the FFT variables that come from the CSS that directly impact Inspire. Again, there is a resource on our resource page that gets at this, but this is the short version here. As I mentioned, the data being accurate in the CSS and the definitions you use when you're answering questions in the CSS will directly affect the outcomes on the Inspire report. So you want to make sure that those are accurate. We talked about the case ID already. One thing I just want to mention is that errors in dates create errors in reports. So it's really important to make sure that dates are entered correctly, whether it's the youth's date of birth, the date of their first session, or their discharge date, because that's going to all directly affect whether or not a youth's data shows up in your Inspire report, whether a youth is counted, for whether their discharge outcomes are counted in the correct time period. For date of birth, we had a really funny incident recently where a provider's report was showing that their average age was negative 21 years old because a date of birth had been entered with 2997 instead of 1997 as the date of birth. So suddenly there was one kid that was, like negative 1,000 years old or negative 100 years old, and that shifted their entire average age to something really kind of bizarre. And that was an easy one to catch because as soon as we saw negative 21, we knew there was an error, but those errors can be more subtle. So just be very conscientious about getting those dates in correctly. And when you close out a case in the CSS, it's really important to specify the discharge date. If you do not specify the discharge date in the CSS will timestamp the data using the date you entered it. So let's say a youth was discharged November 1st. You go into discharge or enter their data in the CSS on December 1st, but you don't indicate the discharge date. CSS is going to use December 1st as the date because that's when you're entering the data, and you haven't given the system another date to use. So make sure you do specify the discharge date in the system so it's using the correct discharge. Otherwise, it's going to really throw off your length of stay in your report because it will look like kids are in FFT much longer than they are. Referral source is important. That gets used in the Inspire report. The global therapist reviews, those get counted based on when they are entered into the CSS. So the data that gets integrated from the CSS tells us the date that the GTR was entered in the CSS versus the actual end date for the GTR review period. So for supervisors, I just mentioned that because the more quickly you can get those entered, the more likely they'll be counted for the correct, they'll show up in the time period you want them to show up for. And discharge information, there is data from the CSS about discharge that very significantly and directly impacts your discharge outcomes in Inspire. One, just make sure to remember that if a youth is placed for an event that occurred before they started FFT, that is an administrative discharge. So I think a couple of the discharge options are youth was placed or incarcerated. Those options should be reserved for youth whose behavior during FFT resulted in them being placed. Those are unsuccessful cases. You don't want a case where you've got placed for something that happened before FFT even began to count against you. That's really an administrative discharge. But when in doubt, always talk to your supervisor or your national consultant, and they can help you make sure that you're entering and coding discharges correctly. The outcome measures, the TOM, the COM, those impact your Inspire outcomes. So we just encourage providers to make sure that they are done for all cases where appropriate. My understanding is that all cases should at least have a therapist outcome measure, and that looks at changes in the youth and in the family functioning. So make sure that those are in there. And lastly, there is a question at discharge in the CSS asking, youth had no new law violations since FFT began. And we asked providers to use that same definition that we used in the follow-up screen in Inspire. So you would answer no if the youth has been charged with a misdemeanor or felony, or adjudicated delinquent or criminally convicted, or a new charge that occurred during treatment. Do not count non-criminal violations of the terms of probation, and do not count incidents that occurred prior to the start of FFT. And again, we share this definition to really encourage a consistent definition across all of the FFT sites in Pennsylvania. And using that consistent definition makes the data more reliable and more valid. And when in doubt, always ask your national consultant. You can contact the Epicenter if you have questions about some of these outcomes and how you're supposed to be answering the questions. If you run into kind of an unusual situation and you're not sure how it fits in, or not sure how to answer the questions for a specific youth, you can always get in touch, and we're happy to help you with that. So the last part of the training will focus on quarterly reporting and the administrator user screens. So as far as how quarterly reporting works, providers, again, that receive funding from the state are expected to use Inspire and expected to submit quarterly reports to the Epicenter. So the Epicenter will send out 3 emails each quarter. And we send out this series of reminder emails, and they're sent over the course of several weeks. And they are to help you ensure that you're following the steps necessary to be able to submit an accurate Inspire report and submit it on time. So we send these emails. It's coordinated with when data integration is happening. The first email is sent a couple of weeks before the quarter ends, and it's a reminder to just make sure that all of your data is entered. You want to make sure all of your data is in the CSS and in Inspire within a few days after the end of a quarter. So right now, December 31st will be the end of the current quarter. We'll be sending out an email reminder mid-December to make sure your data is entered, and you want to make sure it's all in there by January 5th or so. We'll send another email in mid-January, so after, a couple of weeks after the quarter ends. We send a second email reminding you that you need to be writing your Inspire report, looking over it, making sure it's accurate, and that you can catch anything that looks off and correct any errors. During this time, you can contact us for help if needed. And then lastly, we will send an email saying it's time to submit your report. And by that point, all the data should be in because you've done step 1. Your report should be accurate because you've done step 2. And you would run your report and submit it to us. The protocol for submitting the reports and these dates, the time frames, and so forth are all outlined online. You can go to the resource page that I shared earlier, and there's a document on there with the quarterly reporting protocol, which would be really helpful for folks who are responsible for getting those reports in. One thing I just want to highlight is that your Inspire quarterly report cannot be submitted early. So this is all, as I said, set up to coordinate with data integration. Make sure all your data for the quarter is entered. Make sure it's all in the CSS. There's integration that occurs here between step 1 and 2. You're checking your report. You're making sure it's accurate. You're correcting any errors. And then there's integration that occurs again between steps 2 and 3. The reason for that is that if there's something that's incorrect in your Inspire report because of an error in the CSS, you need time to correct it in the CSS, and then that corrected data needs to be integrated before you run your final report. So we wait until after the second integration has happened before we let folks run their reports. So if you send it to us early, we'll send it back and say thanks when we need it again when the submission window opens up. And if you just hold on to that same report and send it back to us, we will look and see the date that it was run at the bottom. And we check to make sure that the date that the report was run was during the reporting submission window. Again, if you have questions about that, as you go through the process, we are more than happy to answer questions. So before we go to the last screen there, I'm going to go over to Inspire. I'm going to log out. Right now I'm logged in as a clinical user. And we will log in as an administrator. Right, and we'll look through how to run the report. I'm just going to focus from now on how to run the report and the process for getting the report in. We do have a number of resources for helping you understand what that report is and how the numbers are calculated and so forth when you look at it. So over on the Inspire resource page, the very first resource here, Understanding Your Inspire Report, it has definitions for all of the outcomes you'll see in your highlights report and how everything is calculated, which variables are used to calculate each outcome, which system those variables come from. Is it using CSS data or Inspire data? And this resource is laid out to match your Inspire report. So like the first page of that resource goes through the population served, which is the very first page of your Inspire report. So you can find the different items easily in this resource. So you can look to this to understand what you're seeing in your Inspire report, and you can also, of course, contact the center with questions. All right, so now that we're logged in as an administrator, from the drop-down menu, you'll see it looks a little bit different. Collaborative board reports, which we will touch base on quickly at the end. Inspire reports, and there's one option here for you. And then account management, username and password, if you want to change your username and password, and a link to create or delete user accounts. So when you have a new user for your site, an administrator needs to log into Inspire, select this, and it will take you to a link where there's a form you can fill out, and that will send the information to the Epicenter so that we can create an account for that new user. All right, so we're going to select Data Highlights Report. The first thing you would do is select your agency, and when you are logged in, you will only see one agency listed. I see all of them, but that's because I have access to that through the Epicenter. So you would just select your agency. I'm going to do all here. And again, this is all just test sample data in the system at this point because we are using the demonstration site. You can select single quarter or multiple quarters. So if you wanted to, you could run a report for the whole year by selecting quarter 1 through quarter 4 of the fiscal year. When you are running your quarterly report to submit, you would just pick single quarter. And let's see, we're going to do quarter 3 of fiscal year 12-13. As I mentioned, we are working on the capacity to run reports by county and by referral source. So in the near future, administrators, when you are logged in, you'll also see a place to further drill down your report by selecting a county and the referral source if you wish. Alright, so once we've selected our parameters for the report, we hit generate, and this usually takes a minute or so. One thing I'll add while it's pulling up the report, when you are entering new data in for clients, if you're adding data and you go to run a report immediately after, you may not see all of your data show up in the report. Inspire refreshes the data warehouse every 15 minutes or so, I believe. So if you are updating your data in Inspire so that you can run your report, enter that data and then go do something else for another half hour and then come back and run your report and everything should be in there. But it doesn't do an immediate, 5-second update. All right, so we've run the report. We have our data highlights report showing up here on the screen. We can make it bigger or smaller using this little slider down here at the bottom. There are arrows up here you can use to scroll through the report. It has 6 pages. This button here would bring you all the way to the end, and this button here would bring you all the way back to the beginning. Get it. When it comes time to save your report, there is this little button here that looks like a 1980s-ish floppy disk. I don't know who uses those anymore, but that's what you would look for, this little floppy disk, and you click, you'd have a drop-down menu here. When you are saving your report to submit to the Epicenter, you would always save it as a PDF file. So you click on PDF. It's going to export your report, click save, right? And I usually just save right to my desktop. I'm going to cancel for the moment. But once you hit save, it'll save your file. But then you need to go back to where you've saved it in order to open up that PDF. So make sure that you pay attention during the saving process to where you are putting the file when you save it. You can also print out the report by using the print button here. And that is pretty much it for running and saving your report. You'll notice when we send out the instructions, the email reminders over the course of a few weeks, when you get to the 3rd step that says it's time to submit your report, there are instructions in that email for how to name the file. We have a specific naming convention we ask folks to use when they're naming the file when they save it, because we receive upwards of 20 to 30 reports every quarter. And so if everyone saves their file as EPIS Inspire report, we can't tell one from the other. We need them to be saved with the name of your agency, your program, the quarter, and so forth. The last thing I just want to show folks, now that we've looked at how to run a report, is that on the administrator screen, there is also one place to enter some data for the program. It says Program Level Data Entry, and it is Collaborative Board Reports. This is a place to indicate if your program is doing reports to a county collaborative board, which is defined as a diverse group of stakeholders coming together. So if you do a report or a presentation or have a meeting with, let's say, just your county child welfare agency, you would not indicate that here because that's not a collaborative board. But if you work with your local community set care group, or you have some other type of collaborative group that comes together, some counties, for instance, have an EDI committee made up of child welfare, JPO, mental health, county assistance office, so forth, all coming together regularly. You could indicate that here. You would click New Report, and you can put the date, whether it was a written report you were sharing or oral, so like a spoken presentation, whether or not you shared outcomes, and you can upload a copy of the report if it's a written report. And that's one of the reasons for tracking this, is that research has found that evidence-based programs that are well connected with a local collaborative board tend to have better outcomes as far as sustaining their program and staying on model. And so there's an interest in tracking whether providers are working closely with their collaborative boards. So that concludes our training for today. I hope it was helpful. Remember that the Inspire team at the Epicenter is always here to assist you and answer questions. And we do have the resources, that wealth of information on our website that we encourage you to use. If you need assistance, you can always use that report problem link. And here on this last slide, you'll see the phone number and email for our main office. And also for myself, I handle most of the requests for assistance. And that's it. Thank you very much, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.